She closed her eyes, ready to accept death in the burning outpost. Then a human voice cut through the smoke. "That's not happening." As hands lifted her broken body. This wasn't rescue. This was defiance. What made a soldier risk everything for an enemy he was ordered to kill? Smoke hung thick between collapsing structures, carrying the sour tang of melted alloys and burned flesh. Shrapnel whined through the air, pinging off the few standing metal panels of what was once Carey Outpost. Leia lay where the concussive blast had thrown her. Her world narrowed to the searing pain in her leg and the acrid taste of defeat. Her comms crackled once with static, then fell silent. No orders, no status reports, no reinforcements. Just the white noise of a communication network that had ceased to exist. Human voices cut through the roar of flames, shouting curses in their guttural tongue. "Die, Blueskin!" The words hit with more force than the shrapnel. She understood enough of their language to know the sentiment, had heard it screamed across enough battlefields. She tried to move, to push herself up on one elbow, but the weight on her shattered leg held her fast. A fallen support beam had her pinned, the crushed armor of her thigh weeping a dark, slow stain into the ashen ground. She saw Elder Trevs's body a few meters away. The old strategist lay where a sniper's round had taken him, his tactical display still flickering uselessly across his chest plate. His death was the final confirmation. There would be no evacuation, no last-minute extraction. The chain of command had snapped, leaving every surviving defender isolated, fighting their own private wars until the end. Leah stopped struggling. Her breathing slowed, each inhalation a deliberate act of will, drawing in the smoke-filled air as a final, petty act of defiance. She focused on the sensation of heat against her skin, the crackle of flames eating through the command tent, the distant sounds of combat fading as human squads moved to secure their victory. This was the reality of their war, stripped of all rhetoric and propaganda. It ended not with heroic last stands, but with individuals broken and alone in the dirt. She made her choice. No screaming, no begging. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her hand found the jagged edge of a broken data slate beside her, her fingers closing around it. A worthless weapon, but hers. Then she let her head fall back against the ruined ground, the muscles in her neck finally relaxing. She closed her eyes against the burning world, waiting for the final shot or the approaching fire. She sought the quiet center of herself, the place beyond pain and fear, and prepared to meet the end with what dignity she could muster. The battle was lost. She was lost. Acceptance was all that remained. Hands closed around her shoulders, pulling her backward over the debris. They were not gentle, but neither were they cruel. They moved with purpose, dragging her free from the fiery wreckage that had become her pyre. The weight on her leg shifted, sending fresh needles of agony through her nervous system. Her eyes snapped open to see a human soldier in scarred tactical armor kneeling beside her. His faceplate retracted to reveal features set in grim concentration. This was Nathan Reeves, though she did not know his name then, only his species and his uniform. He worked with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before, under fire, with limited time and fewer options. He did not look at her face. His attention remained fixed on her leg where the beam had crushed armor and bone. From a pouch on his belt, he produced a compression bandage and a field injector. The injector hissed against her thigh, delivering a cocktail of coagulants and pain blockers that hit her system like a cool wave. His hands moved quickly, wrapping the bandage tight around the ruin of her leg, the pressure immediate and professional. There was no ceremony to it, no words of comfort or explanation. This was field medicine, stripped to its essential components. Stop the bleeding, manage the pain, move the patient. Then he stood, his boots crunching on broken glass and melted plastic. He bent at the knees and lifted her over his shoulders in a fireman's carry that drove the air from her lungs. The position was awkward, painful, but secure. She could feel the tension in his body, the strain of her weight combined with the 40 pounds of armor and gear he himself wore. She expected him to speak, to offer some justification or demand information. Instead, he simply adjusted his grip and began to move, his boots finding purchase in the unstable ground. "That's not happening," he said, the words low and flat, spoken more to himself than to her. They cut through the distant roar of the burning compound and the sporadic weapons fire that still echoed from the perimeter. The phrase was not heroic. It was a statement of fact, a refusal to accept the reality unfolding around them. This was not a rescue in any traditional sense. It was an act of defiance against his orders, against the entrenched hatred between their species, against the very logic of the war they were both dying in. He moved toward the tree line at a steady jog, abandoning his position, his unit, his side of the conflict. Every step carried them farther from the immediate danger of the fire, and the human squads now securing the outpost, and deeper into the unknown. He did not look back. His breathing was even, controlled, the rhythm of someone who had run miles in full combat load. The jungle loomed ahead, a wall of deep green shadows and tangled vegetation that promised concealment and new dangers in equal measure. In that moment, carrying an enemy soldier who should have been left to die, his quiet resolve became a silent challenge to everything either of them had been taught to believe. The thick scent of smoke began to fade, replaced by the heavy, wet air of the jungle. Nathan did not stop moving. He adjusted his grip on her, his breathing steady despite the additional weight and the difficult terrain. The sounds of the burning outpost grew distant, muffled by layers of dense foliage and the constant low hum of insect life. He offered no explanation for his actions, no reassurance about their destination. His entire focus remained on putting distance between them and the battleground, his eyes scanning the path ahead for obstacles, his movements economical and deliberate. Leah broke the silence first. Her voice was strained from smoke and pain. "They will send hunters," she said. "Your people for your treason. Mine for me. They will not stop." She spoke basic with a crisp, formal accent, each word measured and clear. She did not look at him as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the jungle canopy above. She was stating a tactical reality, not issuing a threat. Their respective commands would view them both as compromised assets now, a deserter and a high-value prisoner who had slipped control. The pursuit would be relentless, professional, and equipped for a long-term track. Nathan shifted her weight again, his shoulder digging into her ribs. "The order was wrong," he said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. He did not elaborate on which order or what made it wrong. The statement stood on its own, a simple declaration of principle that outweighed protocol. He stepped over a gnarled root, his boot sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. Some things are bigger than sides. It was not a grand philosophical claim. It sounded more like a personal rule, something he had decided long before today and was now putting into practice under the worst possible circumstances. She was silent for a long moment, taking in his response. Her prejudice against his kind, drilled into her through years of training in combat, warred with the evidence of his actions. He had not left her to burn. He had used field medicine on her leg with a competence that rivaled her own medics. He moved through the jungle with a wary confidence that suggested he was not entirely out of his element. "You are proficient," she conceded, the words tasting foreign. It was the closest she could come to praise. He gave a short, quiet grunt that might have been acknowledgement. "You're alive. That's the job." His tone implied that the job had just been fundamentally redefined and the parameters were still unclear. He understood the debt he had now incurred by pulling her from that fire. She was his responsibility, a complication that made his own survival infinitely more difficult. He had traded the immediate threat of the battle for the prolonged threat of being hunted by two armies, with a wounded non-combatant in tow. They did not speak of trust. The concept was too abstract, too fragile for their situation. Instead, a practical understanding settled between them. She needed his strength and his knowledge of human tactics to evade capture. He needed her knowledge of the terrain and her awareness of Lyrian pursuit patterns to survive. Their partnership was a transaction of necessity, built on the stark realization that alone, neither of them would last long. They were 2 points of opposition finding a temporary, unstable alignment, bound together not by loyalty, but by the shared and certain knowledge of what would happen if they failed. The jungle closed in around them, a green maze that offered concealment and 1,000 new ways to die. A flash of blue moved between the silver-barked lathe trees. It was low to the ground, a blur of cobalt fur and heavy muscle. Leah's hand tightened on Nathan's shoulder. "Stop!" Her voice was a sharp whisper. He froze instantly, his training overriding surprise. He had seen nothing but shifting shadows. Her eyes, adapted for a wider spectrum, had caught the movement he missed. "Volrax," she said. The word carried the weight of a death sentence. The creature emerged into a patch of dappled light. It was the size of a large bear but built like a junglet cat, all coiled power and lethal grace. Its head was broad with no visible eyes, only a wide, wet nose that twitched continuously, sampling the air. It turned its blunt snout toward them. Scent was its vision. Claws, each as long as a combat knife and capable of shearing through armor plate, extended from its massive forepaws and dug into the soft earth. It knew they were there. Hiding was a temporary strategy at best. Nathan slowly lowered Leah to the ground behind the wide base of a tree, his movements deliberate and silent. He drew his service knife, the polished blade a pitifully short defense against such a predator. A pistol would be little better. The creature's speed was legendary. It could close the distance between them in 2 heartbeats, and its thick hide could deflect all but the most precise or powerful shots. Their best hope was cover. He pointed to a massive fallen log, hollowed out by rotten time a dozen meters away. He half-carried, half-dragged Leah toward it as the Volrax let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground. They scrambled into the cramped, earthy darkness of the log just as the creature charged. It did not crash into the wood. Instead, they heard the terrible sound of its claws raking against the outer surface, splinters spraying inward. The log shuddered with each impact. It was testing their shelter, probing for weakness. Inside the dark confines, Leah was already moving. Pain forgotten, her hands worked by touch. She had Nathan's field kit, the one he'd used to bandage her leg. She found the small pressurized canisters of disinfectant spray and a sparker from a ration heater. Her fingers, trained for delicate engine repairs, improvised. She shook the canister, aimed it toward the opening, and triggered the sparker. A short, controlled jet of flame shot from the log's entrance, searing the air. The Volrax recoiled with a furious snort, the stench of burned hair and singed fur flooding their hiding place. It hated fire. Nathan positioned himself at the mouth of the log, knife held ready. He would be the barrier if it decided the fire was a risk worth taking. Leah prepared another canister, her breathing steady. They had created a system in seconds. He would hold the line. She would provide the area denial. Their skills, born from different worlds and different wars, overlapped in a desperate, perfect symmetry. The predator circled outside, confused and angry, its scent-based vision overwhelmed by the acrid smoke. For the moment, the fragile defense held. The log splintered. A claw the length of a bayonet punched through the rotten wood a hand's breadth from Nathan's face, ripping a long gash in their shelter. Sawdust and damp mulch rained down on them. Nathan didn't flinch. He stayed low at the opening, his combat knife held in a reverse grip, his body a barrier between the creature and Leah. He knew their position was collapsing. The Volrax was methodically tearing their fortress apart. Leah drew her sidearm. The report was deafening in the enclosed space. She fired 3 rounds through the opening. The creature roared in pain and surprise, momentarily retreating. The smell of cordite mixed with the musky scent of the beast. She ejected the clip. Only 2 rounds remained. Pistols were for close quarters defense against other soldiers, not for hunting apex predators. It was a stopgap, nothing more. Her eyes scanned their cramped refuge. A broken branch, thick and splintered, lay near her feet. A twisted piece of metal plating, likely from a downed drone, gleamed in a shaft of light piercing the roof of the log. She worked quickly, her injured leg protesting as she shifted position. She used a strip of fabric torn from her undersuit to lash the jagged metal shard to the end of the branch, creating a crude but lethal spear. Her fingers, though smeared with blood and dirt, moved with the surety of an engineer. This was not a weapon of war. It was a tool of survival, born from desperation and immediate need. They did not speak. Their communication became a language of movement and shared breath. A glance from Nathan toward a weakened section of the log, a sharp intake of air from Leah as she tested the spear's balance. He would take the offensive, drawing the creature's attention to the opening. She would use the distraction to strike from a different angle. It was a terrible plan, a gamble that relied on timing they had no way to practice. Nathan lunged from the log, his knife slashing across the Volrax's sensitive nose. The beast recoiled, then struck back with blinding speed. Its massive head snaked forward, jaws wide enough to sever a limb. It nearly did. Teeth like polished obsidian grazed the armored plate on Nathan's shoulder, scraping across the surface with a sound that set the teeth on edge. He tried to pivot away, but his boot slipped on the wet leaves. Leah moved. She pushed herself upright, ignoring the white-hot pain in her leg, and drove the makeshift spear forward with both hands. She did not aim for the heavily muscled body or the thick skull. She went for the open mouth. The sharpened metal shard jammed deep into the soft tissue at the back of the creature's jaw. The Volrak screamed, a wet, guttural sound of shock and agony. It whipped its head sideways, trying to dislodge the object, its focus completely torn from Nathan. It was the opening he needed. While the beast was distracted, thrashing and trying to rid itself of the spear, Nathan closed the distance. He did not attempt a slashing wound. He went for a kill. He plunged his knife up and under the creature's jaw, driving the blade deep into its throat, angling for the spine. He put his entire body weight behind the thrust, leaning into it until the hilt met flesh. The Volrak shuddered once, a massive convulsion that shook the ground, then collapsed. The fight went out of it all at once. The coordinated effort, the shift from defense to a single lethal strike, was over. Silence returned to the patch of jungle, broken only by their ragged breathing and the slow drip of blue blood soaking into the earth. Blue blood seeped into the dark soil of the jungle floor, spreading in a thick, viscous pool around the massive head of the Volraks. The coppery scent of it mixed with the raw smell of opened innards and the lingering ozone of weapons fire. Nathan stood over the carcass, his chest rising and falling in deep, controlled breaths. He wiped his knife clean on a patch of uncontaminated moss, his movements slow and deliberate. Leia leaned heavily against the shattered log, her own breathing ragged. The adrenaline that had fueled their fight was receding, leaving behind the stark reality of the kill and the dull, persistent throb in her leg. They had survived. The knowledge hung between them, heavy and complicated. Leah watched him. She noted the way he checked the body for any final twitches, a habit born from hard experience with dangerous fauna. He had adapted to the threat with a speed that contradicted everything she knew about human rigidity. He had not relied solely on his training or his technology. He had watched her, learned from her improvisation with the fire, and then incorporated it into a plan that was neither purely human nor purely Lyrian. It was something new, something forged in the immediate need to survive. He had been willing to test a dangerous idea under extreme pressure, to step outside the doctrine he had been taught. This capacity for adaptation was not a trait her people attributed to his. Nathan sheathed his knife. He looked from the dead predator to Leah, his expression unreadable. "That was close," he said. The understatement was so profound it almost sounded like a joke, but his tone was flat, factual. He was stating a measurement of risk that had nearly maxed out. "It would have been closer alone," she replied. Her voice was quiet. She was not offering gratitude. She was stating the same factual measurement. Her survival and his were now irrefutably linked to their cooperation. The victory had not been hers or his. It had been theirs. This forced a reassessment that went deeper than tactics. It forced a question about identity. Who were they, stripped of their uniforms and their sides in this war? Were they merely soldiers defined by their command structures? Or was there something else underneath? Something the war had never allowed to surface. "Your command teaches that my kind are monsters," she stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a point of data placed on the table between them. He didn't deny it. "They teach the same about yours." He walked over to the log, retrieving the makeshift spear she had fashioned. He examined the lashings, the careful way the metal shard had been secured. He looked at it for a long moment, then back at her. "Saving you back there, at the outpost." It wasn't a tactical decision. He met her gaze directly for the first time since pulling her from the flames. It was a choice. One I would make again. The admission hung in the humid air. He was confessing to an act that his superiors would label treasonous sentimentality, a dangerous flaw in a soldier. He had chosen a moral imperative over a tactical advantage, and he was stating it plainly, without shame or grandiosity. Leah considered this. The blind hatred she had been trained to hold began to form its first crack. Not all humans were worth killing on sight. Some were worth watching. Some were worth fighting beside. A wary respect settled between them, built not on friendship or shared ideals, but on the shared vulnerability they had just exhibited. They had seen each other at the brink of death, had seen the competence and the fear and the stubborn will to live that existed in both of them. The assumptions they had carried about each other's species, built over generations of conflict, began to erode at the edges, replaced by the far more complicated and personal truth standing a few feet away, covered in sweat and blue blood. The jungle for a moment was silent except for the drip of water from the leaves and the sound of their breathing. Two enemies finding a fragile new footing on common ground. A sleek, undamaged scout craft rested 100 meters from the main crash site, nestled in a cradle of crushed ferns. It had been jettisoned upon impact, its emergency release systems functioning perfectly. It was a Lyrian design, a two-person interceptor with a cockpit canopy of smoked crystal and engine housings shaped like folded wings. It represented their only chance. The decision was made without discussion. They would take it. The goal of mere escape from the jungle shifted instantly to putting planetary distance between themselves and their hunters. Getting the lieutenant into the rear compartment was a struggle. The space was cramped, designed for equipment, not a wounded man. Nathan secured him as best he could with the remaining restraint straps, then took the co-pilot's seat. Leah slid into the pilot's chair, her fingers already dancing across the control array. The console was a smooth, dark surface that lit up at her touch, glowing with soft blue Lyrian script and complex schematic displays. "The ignition is a two-step sequence," she said, her voice clinical. "Primary power comes from the dorsal solar cells, but lift is controlled by these manual thrust regulators." She pointed to a set of levers that looked nothing like the joysticks and pedals of a human vessel. "The navigation system is keyed to my biosignature, but I can grant you temporary access." She worked the console, inputting a string of commands. "The ship is fast. Its hull has limited stealth capabilities against standard scans. Weapon systems are light for defense only." She delivered the information in concise, practical packets, a pilot briefing her new co-pilot. Then she did the unexpected. She pulled her hands back from the controls and placed them in her lap. "You will fly," she stated. It wasn't a question. Nathan looked at her. The controls were utterly alien. The symbols on the displays meant nothing to him. The layout defied all his training. "The systems are, you have pilot certification. I read your file at the outpost before the attack," she interrupted. Her tone left no room for argument. She had made a tactical assessment. His human instincts for flight, his reaction times, might be better suited for the initial, dangerous liftoff through the jungle canopy. Her knowledge was the map. His hands would be the vehicle. It was another distribution of their unique skills, another act of forced trust. He nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. He placed his hands on the control levers. His touch was light, exploratory at first. He tested the tension, the give. He watched the reaction of the ship's systems on the displays, correlating his movements to the flickering readouts. His breathing remained even. There was no panic, no hesitation. He absorbed the foreign interface with a calm, focused competence. He was not flying a Lyrian ship. He was solving a problem. "Our heading?" he asked, his eyes fixed ahead on the narrow gap in the trees he had chosen for their ascent. "The southern colonies," Leah replied. "They are neutral. No extradition treaties. They take refugees." The destination transformed their mission. It was no longer about running from something. It was about running toward something. A possible future. A new home, however uncertain. The goal was no longer survival for the next hour, but for the rest of their lives. Nathan's hand settled firmly on the controls. He took a final deep breath. The engines whined to life, a high-pitched hum that vibrated through the frame of the small craft. "I can do this," he said. The words were quiet, spoken for himself. Then he pushed the thrust levers forward. The ship lifted, clearing the ferns with inches to spare. It angled upward, navigating the narrow corridor between the tall, silver-barked trees. The G-forces pushed them back into their seats. Below them, the wreckage of the command dropship burned, a diminishing pyre marking the end of their old lives. The jungle canopy closed beneath them, and then they were through, bursting into the open sky. The planet stretched out below, a vast expanse of green and blue, and ahead, only the open void and the long, uncertain journey to a neutral star. The console displays flickered once, a brief dance of static, then went black. The low hum of the ship's systems cut out, plunging the cockpit into a silence broken only by the rush of wind against the canopy. They had entered the Logrian Canyon, and its infamous magnetic fields had erased their technology. The ship was dead weight in the air, its navigation, its stabilizers, its weapons all gone. It was just a shell of metal and crystal, caught in the grip of the canyon's unpredictable currents. Crosswinds slammed into the port side, shoving the craft toward a sheer rock face. Nathan's hands tightened on the manual control bars, his knuckles white. Without computer-assisted stabilization, the ship bucked and yawed, each gust a physical blow threatening to tear the wings from the fuselage. He fought the controls, muscles straining, his entire body an instrument of balance and counterforce. Flying blind was one thing. Flying a dead ship through a wind tunnel was another. Logrian interference, Leah said from the co-pilot's seat, her voice calm amidst the violent shaking. The magnetic strata here are unstable. It negates most energy-based systems. Our training simulations warned of it. She was braced in her seat, one hand gripping a support bar, the other resting on a secondary set of manual override levers he couldn't reach. Her knowledge was their only map now. The winds are channeled and amplified by the canyon walls. They shift without pattern. She was his tactical display, her eyes scanning the approaching rock formations, her knowledge of Lyrian geography their sole advantage. Nathan's world narrowed to the feel of the controls in his hands and the visual cues from the window. He had to read the air itself, anticipate the punches before they landed. He saw a ripple in the dust clouds ahead and corrected altitude a second before a massive updraft would have flipped them. He spotted a telltale smoothness on the leeward side of a spire and steered into the pocket of calmer air. It was pure instinct, a dialogue between pilot and environment, conducted without any technological translator. Then movement. Not from the wind, but from the cliffs themselves. Creatures unfolded from crevices in the rock face, their leathery wings snapping open. Crag gliders. They were the size of large birds but built like javelins, all sleek bodies and razor-sharp beak. They rode the same chaotic currents that battered the ship, their movements fluid and native to this treacherous airspace. They swarmed, in a flock, their dark eyes locking onto the disabled craft. They recognized vulnerability. The ship was a wounded animal in their territory. The first one struck. It dive-bombed the canopy, its hardened beak scoring a deep scratch across the crystal. The impact jarred the ship. Another struck an engine housing, then another. They came in waves, using the wind to amplify their speed, hitting and retreating. Nathan couldn't outmaneuver them. He could only try to minimize the damage, to present the toughest parts of the hull to their attacks, and to keep them from a critical system, or the cockpit glass. Hard starboard now. Leah's command was sharp, immediate. He reacted without thought, wrenching the controls. The ship banked violently, narrowly avoiding a collision with a massive rock pillar a glider had just led them toward. She was calling. Out the threats he couldn't see. Her voice a steady guide in the chaos. Dive 2 degrees. Hold it. Now level. He followed her instructions, his hands executing the maneuvers with a trust that went beyond words. Their survival depended on the seamlessness of this partnership, on her eyes and his hands operating as a single unit. They flew through the heart of the storm, a silent, disabled ship pursued by a living cloud of predators. Nathan wrestled with the bucking controls, his arms burning with the effort. Leah called out wind shifts and approaching attacks, her voice never faltering. They didn't speak of trust, they enacted it. Each successful evasion, each coordinated dodge, deepened a bond forged in the certainty that failure for one meant death for both. The gliders eventually broke off, their interest waning as the ship proved a frustrating, unpredictable target. The immediate danger passed, leaving behind the relentless manual battle against the canyon's winds, and the unspoken understanding that they had just passed a test far greater than any magnetic field. A shriek of tearing metal ripped through the jungle's canopy, a sound so violently out of place it silenced the birds and insects. They both looked up. A Lyrian dropship, its elegant lines broken and bleeding smoke, trailed a plume of black and orange fire as it carved a destructive path through the trees. It struck the earth a kilometer to the east with a gut-deep impact that shuddered through the ground beneath their feet. The ensuing silence felt heavier than the noise, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Leah's hand closed on Nathan's arm, her grip tight. "We go now." Her voice was low, urgent. That was a command vessel. Its transponder alone will draw every patrol and recovery team from 50 clicks out. Human, Lyrian, it does not matter. That crash site is a beacon. We must be gone before they arrive. She was already pivoting, putting weight on her injured leg, her gaze fixed on the deeper, safer jungle to the south. The logic was impeccable, born from a lifetime of tactical training. The site represented everything they were fleeing: the war, the chain of command, the certain death that came with recapture. To approach it was insanity. Nathan did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the distant column of smoke, a dark stain against the green. He took a half step forward, then another, his head tilted as he listened. A new sound threaded its way through the quiet, faint but unmistakable. A human voice, ragged with pain, calling out, "Is anyone there, medic?" The words were standard, laced with the particular accent of a Terran frontier officer. He moved toward the sound without another word, his pace quickening to a jog. Leah hissed a curse in her own language but followed, her movements stiff with pain and frustration. They reached the edge of the devastation. The dropship had plowed a trench through the jungle, scattering burning debris and shattered trees in a wide arc. The main fuselage lay crumpled against a rock face, its Lyrian markings scorched and blackened. And there, pinned by a collapsed section of bulkhead, was a human lieutenant. His uniform was torn, his face pale beneath a mask of grime and blood. One of his legs was bent at a sickening angle, his eyes, wide with shock and pain, locked onto Nathan's human features with a surge of desperate hope. This man was the embodiment of the system Nathan had rejected. He was command structure and blind obedience. He was the officer who would have given the no prisoners order at Carry Outpost, who would condemn Nathan's actions as the highest form of treason. Standard protocol here was brutally clear: leave him. The jungle or the Lyrian recovery teams would finish the job. It was the smart move, the safe move, the only move that made any sense for two fugitives whose survival depended on invisibility. Nathan looked from the wounded officer to Leah. Her expression was hard, a mirror of the practical, unforgiving logic of the war they had just escaped. She shook her head once, a minute, definitive gesture. This was a line not to be crossed. Taking him was a burden they could not carry, a risk that jeopardized everything. Nathan's jaw tightened. He walked over to the wreckage, his boots crunching on broken glass and twisted metal. He knelt beside the lieutenant, his hands already moving to assess the injuries. He didn't look at Leah as he spoke, his voice low and final, leaving no room for debate. "No, we bring him with us." The decision was made. His mercy, it seemed, knew no boundaries. It would extend even to those who represented the very power that would see him executed. He was drawing a new line, one based on a principle that had nothing to do with sides and everything to do with the value of a single life, even an enemy's. Leah watched him kneel beside the wounded officer. Her expression was stone. "He is your enemy," she stated, her voice low and flat. "When he is stable, when his mind clears, he will remember your face. He will remember mine. His duty will demand he report us. Our survival depends on silence and distance. You are adding a voice to our trail. You are giving our hunters a witness." She represented the cold, practical arithmetic of survival. Every extra minute at the crash site, every gram of supplies used on this man, every sound he might make on their journey, it all added to a risk calculation that already teetered on the brink of failure. Taking him was an act of profound self-sabotage. Nathan did not look up from his work. His hands were busy, cutting away the torn fabric of the lieutenant's uniform to expose the compound fracture. The bone was a white shard against the torn muscle and dark blood. The lieutenant's breathing came in short, pained gasps, his eyes glazed with shock. From his dwindling medical kit, Nathan produced a syringe of high-grade pain suppressant. He administered it with a quick, professional jab to the man's neck. Then he began the messy work of cleaning the wound and setting the leg for travel, using splints fashioned from pieces of wreckage and more of his precious bandages. His movements were as clinical and efficient as they had been when he'd treated her leg. He was expending critical resources on a man who would likely see him hanged. Leah took a step closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "This is a mistake. We cannot carry him. He will slow us. He will attract attention. If we are found because of this, we become enemies again. You understand this? There will be no partnership. Only captor and prisoner, or corpses." She laid out the inevitable conclusion with brutal clarity. Their fragile truce, built on shared necessity, would not survive the strain of this new burden. Failure would force them back into their original roles. Nathan finished tying off the last bandage. He looked up at her then, his face smeared with soot and sweat, his eyes holding a resolve that had hardened into something absolute. "I'm not him," he said. The phrase was simple, quiet, and it cut through all her logical objections. He wasn't referring to the lieutenant. He was referring to the soldier he was supposed to be, the one who followed no prisoner orders, the one who left wounded enemies to die, the one who valued mission parameters over basic humanity. He was drawing a line in the dirt of the crash site, defining himself by what he refused to become. His command structure expected a pragmatist, a killer who understood the cost-benefit analysis of a single life. He was refusing the assignment. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crackle of dying fires and the lieutenant's shallow breathing. Leah studied his face, seeing the unwavering certainty there. He would do this with or without her. Arguing was pointless. The decision was made. Her resistance didn't evaporate. It settled into a grudging, simmering acceptance. She gave a single curt nod. It wasn't approval. It was acknowledgement of a stubborn, inconvenient fact. Nathan Reeves was a man who saved lives even when it was stupid, even when it was dangerous, even when it was his enemies. His mercy was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength, one that existed in tense, uneasy coexistence with the enmity that had defined their entire relationship. She would comply not because she agreed, but because their fates were now inextricably linked to his impossible choice. They would carry this burden together. A long, grinding shriek of metal on rock echoed through the dead cockpit. The ship's belly scraped against the canyon wall, the vibration shuddering up through the seats and into their bones. Nathan saw it a moment before the impact, a narrow shelf of rock little more than a fracture in the cliff face, barely wider than the ship's own landing struts. It was their only option. The canyon floor was a kilometer below, a distant smear of shadow and sharp stone. There were no other ledges, no safe harbors. This was a desperate gamble against the laws of physics and their own dwindling luck. One mistake would send them into the abyss. A gust of wind, a misjudgment of speed, a fractional error in his approach angle. The ship was a dead weight, responding only to his brute force on the controls. He had no instruments to confirm his altitude, no thruster control for last-second adjustments. This landing would be made by sight, by feel, and by a deep, instinctual memory of how a craft should settle. "Crosswind from the west," Leah said, her voice a calm, focused counterpoint to the violent shaking. "It's dropping. Hold your line." Gliders 3 o'clock, but holding position. She was his external sensor suite, her eyes constantly scanning, feeding him the data his dead panels could not. She did not tell him how to fly. She told him what was happening. The trust was implicit, absolute. His hands moved on the control bars, making tiny, precise corrections. He ignored the burning in his shoulders, the sweat trickling down his temple. His entire world was the approaching ledge, the feel of the wind buffeting the craft and the sound of her voice. He flared the nose up at the last possible second, killing their forward momentum. The ship dropped the final meters. The landing struts hit the rock with a jarring metallic bang. The craft tipped dangerously to port, its left side strut hovering over empty air for a heart-stopping second before it settled back, groaning, onto the ledge. The right strut was flush against the rock wall. The nose and tail hung over the edge. They had centimeters to spare on all sides. He killed the quiet emergency power that had kept the control surfaces marginally responsive. Silence. It flooded in, profound and immense, broken only by the low whistle of the wind whipping past their precarious perch and the faint, ticking sound of the ship's hull cooling. They sat there for a long moment, not speaking, listening to the absence of screaming metal and roaring wind. The adrenaline slowly receded, leaving behind a hollowed-out calm. They were alive. They had stopped. Leah was the first to move. She unstrapped and leaned forward, peering out her side window at the rock face. Her eyes, sharper than his, scanned the vertical stone. She found it almost immediately. A recessed door, almost perfectly camouflaged against the granite, marked only by a faint, worn symbol. "A maintenance airlock," she said, her tone shifting from tactical to analytical. "For canyon survey teams. It will lead to a service tunnel. The network should connect to an old mining outpost abandoned off the grid." The discovery was more than shelter. It was a path, a hidden route that could take them deep into the planet's crust, Away from scanners, away from patrols, away from the war that hunted them. For the first time since the outpost burned, a real sustainable escape was not a desperate hope, but a tangible plan laid out in the rock before them.